Detroit Lions have a new defensive line coach for the 2025 season, and that's Kacy Rodgers. And there's been a lot of buzz around Kacy Rodgers. So today we're going to break down the hiring and talk about what Kacy Rodgers could be bringing to Detroit. So let's get right into it. So yes, today we're finally doing our breakdown video for the Lions' new defensive line coach. We've had fantastic defensive line coaches over the last few seasons. It's meant a lot for the development of this defensive line, and you just add another one to the mix here in Kacy Rodgers. But I know there's been a lot of buzz, and you guys wanted this video, so here we are. Really going to dive into the historical context of Kacy Rodgers, the defensive lines that he's been a part of, the success that he's had, and what it could look like stylistically with the Lions here, because he's been a part of many different schemes, but what it could translate to with the Detroit Lions is what we're going to discuss. And really, when I think it's been at its best, what it's looked like as a defensive line, how the Lions can get there. So a lot of things to dive into. This may be a little bit all over the place, but I'm going to do my best to try to stay in order. Now, as a quick background, he's been an NFL coach since 2003 with the Dallas Cowboys, a defensive tackle coach, and he's stuck in the NFL since that time, then defensive line coach, then to Miami, and he was with Miami for a long stint, 2008 through 2014. Then he lands with the New York Jets. He actually becomes the Jets defensive coordinator. Todd Bowles became the head coach with the Jets. Wasn't the longest tenure, but there was some success there, especially early. And then landing with Tampa Bay, which again, kind of meeting back up with Todd Bowles, winning a Super Bowl with Tampa Bay as becoming the defensive line coach / run game coordinator in 2022. And now here he is after this past season with Tampa Bay. Showed some of the style or schematic examples of how he played Washington versus how we did, and how their game plan I thought was much better. It was much more aggressive to taking away the run than what we did against the run in that game. And they had a lot more success, of course, but I don't want to focus on that as much as just what he's done in the past and how I think it's going to translate. So the first stop that I want to make here is going back to his time with Miami, because I think this may end up being the best comparison one-to-one of what it could look like from the Lions versus what it looked like with the Miami Dolphins. And we're going to use some player comps here to kind of just go across the board and show where I see some similarities. But let's go back to this time with Miami, because there's a couple of things that always feel pretty consistent with the Kacy Rodgers defense. We'll talk about the importance of the interior defensive line, because typically when his defensive lines are great, that's usually what you see. They are typically loaded with depth as well. Length is a huge part of defensive lines that he's a part of. But this 2008 to 2014 run with Miami is incredibly intriguing, because in 2012, they kind of shifted more into a 4-3 scheme. Now, for the most part, he's been a lot of 3-4 defenses stylistically. That's kind of what they lived in with Tampa Bay. That's what they played in base. Now, there's been versatility out of that. Sometimes you get 4 down linemen. Sometimes you get 2 down linemen, right? There's a lot of flexibility with that Todd Bowles defense. And some of the creative things like that they do on third down, for example, to blitzing the quarterback, those are things that I think will translate over, and we'll talk about those. But this was really the first time I think we can point to like a 4-3 traditional defense that they switched to. And it was interesting because their personnel-wise was there for a 3-4 type of defense, but they shifted into this. I think a lot of it had to do with Cameron Wake, because that 4-3 defensive end, he was outstanding. He actually in 2012, which is what graphic we're going to use here, he led the NFL in disruptions. That was a stat I guess they tracked back in the day from Pro Football Focus, with 86 in the NFL that season. So when I throw the comps on the screen here, we kind of go across the board. You're going to see there's a lot of familiarity as well with these defensive linemen. There's a lot of guys that kind of went from spot to spot that he was at. There's a lot of continuity with his defensive lines. You notice that there's not a ton of changes usually. There's guys that are drafted to develop. They kind of sit underneath the veterans, and then that's the next step. But for the most part, there's a lot of continuity. You don't get a lot of overhaul year after year after year, which I think is a really good sign. 2012 season, I think, is a fantastic example, because Miami's defense is great in 2012, and you're going to see it third in expected run defense, points added, 4 yards per carry, which was top 10. Yards, total yards allowed, top half of the league. Tackles for loss, 12th. 42 sacks, that was 7th, and then they were 4th in quarterback hits that season. So did a lot of good things numbers-wise. But when you look at the players they had across this board, this is interesting, because to me, this looks stylistically what the most similar thing is to the Detroit Lions. I don't expect the Lions are going to drastically change what they've been just because of like, oh, new defensive line coach, he's got to change everything. They're going to play to the personnel they have. So whatever they feel that strength is, which means they think they're going to play both 3-4, they'll play some 4-3 in base. They'll have a whole bunch of different looks up front. But the traditional 4-3 in base is typically what they leaned into there, with a Sam backer that would roll up on the line of scrimmage in Mizzy, which, if I'm saying any of these names wrong, I apologize. These are older players, and I don't know how to pronounce a lot of these names. They had their nose tackle, and this is something that, especially in the past, really getting away from some of the Tampa Bay, but Tampa Bay had this too with Greg Gaines, and we'll get to that. Greg Gaines is very similar across the board to a guy like Roy Lopez. There's a quick little comp for you, but they've had really good interior defensive line depth, and they've always really had like a traditional nose tackle, even in their 4-3 defenses. So here you had Paul last name I'm not going to try to pronounce, at nose tackle, 6'4", 340. That really had some good depth. They had Randy Starks, who was fantastic. He would lean as kind of the under tackle. He'd play that 3 technique role. They ran a lot of under fronts within the 4-3 defense as well, which would put the 3 technique on the weak side of the formation, which would allow you to do a lot of times try to get one-on-ones against a guard, which in our case would be like our Lee McNeil. So they did that with Randy Starks, try to create one-on-one opportunities with him. They played a lot of those kind of under fronts towards the strength of the formation. Similarity you may notice with the Lions here is that while their interior defensive line will rotate and those guys will shift, and the Lions sometimes don't flip their interior defensive linemen because for Miami, they had 2 very different styled interior defensive linemen. You had Starks, who was the guy that was going to get after it. He's a little bit less, he's a little bit more undersized, close to 300 pounds. Then you had a guy like Paul, who's 340 pounds, who's your true nose tackle. You didn't have as much versatility or flexibility. So there's always going to be differences. Those 2 guys would flip on the interior based on the strength of the formation if that's the front they were going to play. For the Lions side of things, they don't really have to do that. They can kind of just shift their defensive line, or you call it bumping their defensive line. Even Tampa Bay over this, past couple of seasons would do this as well, but they would do this across the entire front 7 where they'd bump. So Joe Tryon could go from playing on line of scrimmage to bumping to an off-ball backer, and they could just shift the entire defensive line because they had a lot of guys in the mold of 6'2", 6'3", 280 pounds. So everybody up front could kind of shift around and move. Vita Vea had that flexibility as well to shift and move. So that is one similarity that I think could carry over to the Lions. There's a lot of flexibility to shift, move guys, and having that flexibility that guys can play in different spots on the inside. But they had 2 very different interior defensive line players, so typically those guys would actually flip. Defensive end, here's the interesting part. So it was Odrick, apologize if I'm saying his name wrong, but he was actually their transition to 4-3 defensive end. Now, he came there as part of a 3-4 defense, which he fit better. It was like, 3-4 defensive end. He kind of played between the tackles. That's his build, 6'5", 300 plus pounds, right? Long. It's like, that makes sense. But as a transition, he had to kick to defensive end. Now, this is not the first time that a defense like this has used big defensive ends. Let's look at another comparison. Levi Onwuzurike. So Levi last season obviously started playing some defensive end for us. I think that will translate again this year because of health reasons. Sometimes you have to do that. And for the Jets, we got to see that as well, where they ultimately had Richardson kick out wide. So they went for a guy in Richardson who was over 300 pounds. They'd kick him out wide. They didn't have a lot of edge rush help. They had a lot of dudes in the interior. They were loaded on the inside. So they would just kick him to the edge, and they had a lot of dudes. They had one of the best front, 4s or best front 3s, you could say, across the board. They were just loaded with talent. Leonard Williams, Wilkerson, Snacks Harrison. So when you have that, it's like, all right, those guys are going to be on the field, but their edge rush wasn't as deep. So they would kick one of their bodies to the outside linebacker position and let him rush there. And that was their kind of attempt. It worked a little bit there. So that was their attempt. But in this defense, a little bit different. You still see that flexibility was a thing because they took a big guy that was 4 defensive end in the 3-4. They made him a 4-3 defensive end. And I won't say that it went the best for them in that spot because he didn't have as much rushing ability. So it kind of led to some limitations. And ultimately, the next step was going to be guys like Olivier Vernon becoming the defensive end, a little bit smaller, kind of fit to play that true role. They also drafted, I believe it was Elijah Jones. I could have that name wrong, but didn't really work out for them. That pick kind of missed. But the point is, when they moved that, which really got Wake into the left defensive end role, which means that he would constantly match up with right tackles to get those opportunities to rush a passer. And the reason that's important as well is because what they did with their defensive ends in this time is their defensive ends didn't flip. These guys would remain on the same side of the formation all the time. So Wake was your lefty end, Vernon, but specifically Odrick at this time, who was your right defensive end, right? Those guys stayed in their lanes. They stayed in their spots. That's what the Lions typically do. Now they'll flip, but most of the time they don't flip based on the strength of formation. Our interior will shift, but the defensive ends stay where they're at, right? Because they have the flexibility in terms of build to play the run and pass. That's the goal. Davenport, Hutchinson, Levi, where for them, a lot of time, Levi's a little bit of a different example. Pascal, like for them, they'll typically keep Hutchinson at right defensive end and they'll have their other piece at left defensive end. They typically don't move those guys right before the snap. They stay where they are. So that's similar to what we saw the Miami Dolphins do as well with their defense front, is kind of utilize the same example. So across the board, I put kind of the comps that you can look at for both of these sides here. When you have that nose tackle, the Lions now kind of have 2 of them with DJ Reader and Tyleik Williams, though early in the season, he's going to have to play some of the lean role, which he did back at Ohio State, which is fine. It's the flexibility the Lions have, which they've had at times, but sometimes they haven't, right? You just adjust to what you have. So Miami here in this spot would flip guys before the snap. You saw different fronts, like with Tampa Bay, where they could just adjust, where it was like, all right, he could just kick out, and that would be Vita Vea. He could just go to the 3 technique, and he felt comfortable with it because he was that athletic. So there was different fronts that had capabilities of doing things like that. Or on the defense fence spots, right? They could just move guys around because everybody kind of was a similar build. multiple guys were comfortable stand up. With Tampa Bay, it was Golston. He could stand up. Nelson could stand up. So they were very comfortable. Like, hey, he could just bump to outside linebacker. He doesn't need his hand in the dirt. So they had that flexibility, lines flexibility specifically, while they have it on the ends too, because they have a lot of guys in kind of a similar mold here with Pascal. Levi's a little bit different, but you have Levi. You can throw Mekhi Wingo. They have a lot of dudes that kind of fit into this mold. Because of that, you have some flexibility there, but they also have flexibility in the interior, which means they want the flip, but it can also help them early in the season with those big bodies. And as you'll notice as we go through this, a lot of the success of these defensive lines typically revert back to their interior defense line's awesome. And it's really tough to run in the inside. And I think an easy example to demonstrate this, like forget the player names for a second. Whenever we played Tampa Bay, we had a very similar strategy. We threw the ball out on early downs because running the ball between the tackles against this team was a problem. And then there was also, and they played very aggressively against the run. Part of that is they play some heavier boxes. They'll play very heavy boxes. They have guys that can play multiple gaps like Vea, so they can play off that a little bit as well. And because their aggression gets run, they'll play a lot of five-man fronts. They'll stack the line of scrimmage with some big bodies. If you put like two tight ends in the game or something, they'll stack with a five-man front. So it's tough to run against the team up the middle, and that's also because they're so good on the interior. So the Lions' plan was typically, hey, run, pass the ball in early downs. Then when they did run, it was a lot of wide runs, right? With things that would hit were wide runs, take screens, right? They were trying to get towards the outside against this team. That's because they were so built in the interior. Now, the other comparison is that Sam backer spot, and they had that, and it was missy for them a lot of times. There was flexibility there, right? They could, again, change their front. They could have their Wheeler, I think it was at the time. He could step down the line and do that. Barnes is that for the Lions. So this was actually a defense that had that piece. And if you look at it from a snap count perspective, from pass rush to run defense to coverage opportunities, he was much more utilized in coverage than he was as a pass rusher, not by a massive margin, but he was more in coverage than as a pass rusher. He was mainly out there as well for run defense. That's essentially what Derek Barnes is. He'll pass rush, but not as much as, he's out there for run defense, and he will drop into coverage more often than, some of those guys they had in Tampa Bay, which would be like your Shaq Barretts, who played outside linebacker but didn't drop into coverage much at all. He did, but less than like 100 snaps a year. Barnes will drop into coverage a good amount. So he's similar to Mizzy in that sense, where they're both Sam backers. They have a similar type of build, and both those guys will play on the line of scrimmage. So the comparison, schematically, stylistically, I think will look similar to what we saw with Miami, just with some difference on how they can actually play things up front. With Odrick is also similar to Levi when you want to compare here. He went to 4-3 DN, but he also would play in the interior. Due to injuries, he'd kick into the inside, and he could kind of step down into like that 3-tech role, which we know that Levi can do as well. Now, he struggled with some double teams, but Levi showed comfortability there. So his flexibility, I think, is actually better than what they had at that time, but he'll do a similar thing for us. He'll kick to the inside as well, especially probably early in the season when we need him to, where he's not just living at DN, it's just getting your best four on the field. At times, he'll kick to defensive tackle as well. So I think there's actually a lot of similarities between how those two can also work as well, which brings similarity across the board. Then you look at the list and you see the improvements over the year. You see some of the pieces that they had, and it was typically a pretty loaded defensive line. The yellow kind of showcases like the new additions. Maybe it was like a free agent signing that they added. And then you also have draft picks listed in here as well. Like, hey, what round were they taken? And as you can see, there's a lot of consistency with the pieces they had year after year after year after year. But a big part of this as well is typically they also had a lot of size as well. So you had guys like Langford, a third-round pick, 6'6", 305 pounds, right? They had that kind of size. Merling, 6'2", 270 pounds. Cameron Wake was 6'3", 263, who in my comparison, I'm comparing him to Aiden Hutchinson, who will play in a similar role. He's used to get after the quarterback, maybe the best pass rusher in football. Kind of a similar idea right there. Taylor, who was a free agent signing, 6'6", 255. Those tackles inside as well. And then you have guys like Shelby at 265, and that's kind of the flexibility they had. They had those big bodies that could play interior, could play on the outside, but they were flexible to play different defensive end type of roles. And the importance of that is that's why they went from 3-4 to 4-3, because they were able to do that with the personnel that they had. So they had 3-4 personnel early until you get to 2012, where they ended up kind of shifting back into a 4-3 type of defense. And as you can see, there's some guys that carried over there. They started to bring in some new pieces for that, but that also fits what the Lions are right now. And you could just see across the board that there was a lot of improvement happening with a lot of these pieces. And if you look at that 2013 season, you can see a ton of improvement. Starks was awesome on the inside. I think of the Aleem McNeils right there, right? The guy that can get after it, win one-on-one, can deal with double teams if he has to. You can see Odrick had some success still, even with the position change. Wake obviously was one of the best pass rushers, and I think even he grades out kind of similarly to Aiden Hutchinson from that sense as well. Then you had guys like Deion Jordan, who came in, and I wouldn't say it really worked out with a guy like Deion Jordan for the most part, but they try to get one of those outside pieces for what they were doing defensively. Next spot would be the Jets. Now I'm going to throw their stats across the board here. Of course, one of the overlaps is John Morton was the offensive coordinator for the Jets in 2017, just for that one season. Todd Bowles was the head coach. Now he is here, but also Kacy Rodgers was the defensive line coach for the Jets. So it's easy overlap right there. Easy connection. Maybe they had a little bit of a relationship at that time. with the Jets, you could see 2014 was before he got there. They were a great defensive line for the most part every single year, especially early, right? They went from being good to great when he stepped in. He was a part of this, and you could see it just based on the run defense numbers. Were typically top tier in the league. Up until 2018, they were top tier at stopping the run every single season. But also keep in mind that he was the full defensive coordinator at this time as well. So it wasn't just defensive line coach, he was full defense coordinator. Again, they were playing that 3-4 style of defense, so it was a little bit different. Defense was a little bit up and down up until the kind of that final season. Situationally, they were typically really good as well. Third down defense is pretty strong across the board. Red zone defense had some strong years there as well. And again, run defense is kind of where everything seems to have started. There was some real success there with Todd Bowles. Again, it just didn't work out in the end. And you're going to see with some of this, it was their inability to actually bring in talent. That became an issue as well. And then you look at this. And now this is kind of the best D-line builds is what I listed. That is, this is one of the best seasons for the Jets. So looking at those stats, 2015, they were great, right? It was the first year he got there. And what they had on the defensive line was exactly what I think the Lions are trying to do with Tyreek is they want to build a great interior. As it was pointed out, hey, if your interior defensive line is soft, you don't have a great defensive front. Right? Snacks Harrison, Wilkerson, Leonard Williams. That's pretty darn good. And that's when Richardson kicked to the outside to give some edge help. They gave up one rushing touchdown that season. Now, if you're asking yourself what happened to that defensive line, why did the stats drop so much? It was really the personnel around them kind of fell apart, and these were some bad front office decisions, but it also speaks to some of the versatility as well. We talked about how they're multiple defensively, 4-3-3-4, and we even saw that with this Jets team, where they could have guys, like we'll talk about Jenkins as an outside linebacker, that could play with his hand in the dirt, could step down, could play a four-man front, but he could kick out and also drop into coverage, so it looked more like your traditional 3-4 defense. So they had that versatility, that multiple defense, which is why the very next season they took a lot of that personnel in 2019 when this all ended, and they went to a 4-3 defense because they had personnel to do that. So we know that being a multiple front that can get into both 4-3, 3-4 looks, five-man fronts, which they did as well, speaks back to the versatility they have up front and guys that could do both. And I think the Lions have that too. Still a one-gap style as a majority, but that being said, you can jump into, hey, certain player can handle a couple multiple gaps on the interior. That's ideal, but we're still going to play kind of that gap and a half style. We know that's not going to change. But as you can see, they go to McClendon at nose tackle because ultimately they let Snacks Harrison walk, and they did that because he went and got a big deal, and also that allowed them to pay Wilkerson, which did not work out, so that was a bad decision. McClendon actually did have a really strong career with the New York Jets. You can make the case he got better every year, but he was an elite run defender for them, so they got a lot of value out of adding McClendon, which ultimately he was traded to Tampa Bay once Kacy Rodgers went to Tampa Bay. 2017, it fell apart a little bit more here, and this is because then they ended up moving off of Richardson, and this off Richardson because there was a lot of extra stuff going on, especially off the field. So now that defensive line has been kind of picked apart. They go with Jenkins, who was a third-round pick, and it didn't necessarily connect with Jenkins as at that high of a level. However, the build of Jordan Jenkins is again similar to the DNs that the Lions have now, or an edge rusher at 6'2", 260 pounds. He was a long edge rusher. He was a third-round pick that was a good run defender, and we saw that in the NFL. It was at a solid level in the NFL. He came out pretty hot as a rusher from production standpoint, but that didn't last as well. He wasn't a great pass rusher coming out of college, but it fits kind of the mold of our edge too. And then you go to 2018, and this is where we start to see the rotation and move off Wilkerson because that was a mess. And that's when it ended up being Nathan Shepard, who was a third-round pick, which is now with New Orleans, who was an interior player in college that they thought maybe 3-4 DN. He actually played a lot on the inside, but he was a 3-4 DN for this defense. And he ended up actually having a relatively productive rookie season as a third-round pick. The problem is, as the season went on, he ultimately got replaced by Henry Anderson, who was fantastic for the prices they ended up paying. 48 pressures for Anderson. It was more than 2 times the amount that he had as his most previously. He also graded a 74 against the run. He had a fantastic season. So they got a lot out of McClendon. They got Shepard, who didn't have a great rookie season because ultimately he was sort of benched, but he was still productive both as a run defender and as a pass rusher. As a rookie, he was a similar kind of build to an Akeem Hicks. And then Henry Anderson, who they got a ton out of Henry Anderson, who ultimately took over that position. They also had guys like Mike Pennell, who is now with Kansas City as their backup nose tackle. That was an incredibly effective elite run defender who was, again, having depth at nose tackle, just like Tampa with Greg Gaines. They have that depth at nose tackle. And these were more true nose tackles definitely at this time with McClendon and also having a guy like Pennell. These were more true than kind of the versatility in the interior. The point is they were able to get a lot of production out of what they had, but ultimately the defensive line just kind of fell apart around the pieces that they had from bad front office decision. We go to his time with Tampa Bay, and we'll look at a couple of these seasons here as well from a player perspective, but also from a production perspective. So from a production perspective, there was some really strong numbers, especially when he stepped in. A lot of things changed pretty quickly there with Tampa Bay from a numbers spot. You can see the pressure rates all jumped. They were a very blitz-heavy defense. That's kind of a thing for Todd Bowles. That's always been a thing. We know stylistically in the back end. I don't want to give too much credit to this because it was a Todd Bowles defense, but they were a heavy cover 3 team. They had versatility out of that. Their safeties moved all over the place, and they would play some some hard flats, squeeze things back inside, kind of cut off the sidelines against us. And again, they were awesome on the interior, and what they had on the edges, they had a ton of flexibility. Joe Tryon, Golston, Allen, Nassib, Carl Nassib. They had a lot of guys that were similar molds that fit really well, 6'6", 280, 6'6", 275. And then on the interior, they had depth. They had McClendon at 310, who was also a guy that they already had before, so it makes some sense. There was carryover there. They had Nunez Roches, I think that's how you say his name, another interior defensive lineman. And again, these guys are behind Vita Vea and Ndamukong Suh. And then ultimately, when they moved off Suh, they brought in Akeem Hicks. So they were very deep on the interior, very deep. They've always had this two studs there. And then outside of that, they had a ton of rotational depth on the outside. So I think stylistically, a lot of this makes sense in comparison to the Lions and what they're trying to do. Be awesome on the interior and have a lot of rotations and a lot of flexibility on the back end. Guys you trust in coverage, guys that are going to set the edge, guys with a lot of length, kind of these bigger molds. They're not a whole bunch of 240-pound edge rushers. These guys will play from the 5 tech out to the 9, but they can set the edge against the run, and that's kind of where they're built across the board. And you can see everybody improved that first season that he got there. Everybody that was a carryover from the year before got better the first season that Kacy Rodgers was there, which makes sense. Now, I didn't actually note the stats from Vita Vea or Suh. Suh was just getting older towards retirement, and Vita Vea is pretty darn awesome every single season, so I didn't want to do too much with that. It's like Vita's just really good, right? It was a top 15 pick, and the Lions would love to find their Vita Vea with a Tyleik Williams. He's just that good of a piece, and he's that versatile, but they definitely did find the versatility in a big body. That they did find. They did find a guy that's comfortable outside of a guard, and that is helpful because for different fronts, right, he can, at that point, not only can he rush the quarterback still from that spot, but now he can deal with double teams if you need him to, which if his ability to deal with double teams can allow you to play a lot of different second level alignments, so they could stack fronts and shift fronts at the snap. They could have a guy slant down. Linebackers could fill different gaps at the snap. So they had a lot of versatility too to kind of disguise things because of the versatility up front. They could slant guys. They had the agility to do it. And then at the second level, they could be really aggressive off of that and play off of that. It could be difficult to pick up some of those blocks in the bear front. And we got to see that where, they run 3-0 and a 3 technique, right? Where they would really stack down to kind of stop the inside run. That would force you to kick it outside. You would kick it to those outside linebackers that were Shaq Barrett or Joe Tryon. And these guys are not tiny, right? These are athletic pieces that even though maybe most of them didn't hit on the outside as rushers, these guys could play the run. So they would force it to those guys as they felt comfortable playing in space, which is a little bit different stylistically than what we always do, but we can do things like this at times with some versatility. Davenport could kick out to a 9 technique. Hutchinson could play a 9 if you wanted him to. The only difference is those guys are much more comfortable in coverage versus the line. You could see the staple of flexibility here just by how their outside linebacker plays this. When the tight end shifts, he can go from a 9 and he could step down closer to a 5. In this case, I call him more of a 7 technique. And that's the shift that they can make just simply based on where the tight end is aligned. And those are the kind of things that they can do to roll their fronts pre-snap by the looks that they get. That's the versatility they showed. They don't want Davenport and Hutchinson running his coverage as much as Shaq Barrett and Joe Tryon would. So that's the big difference. Those guys can play the run, rush, and passer from out there. It's just that they're not going to drop into coverage as often. But you can do that if you want to stack up and try to stop the run. Dudes that can do it again, they just won't drop into coverage very often. Of course, you could throw Barnes into that mix as well because he can drop into coverage. That's why they'll probably do things a little bit different stylistically than this. But they do have some of the athletes that can do that, for example. So there was a lot of that flexibility up front. There was those shifting fronts post-snap. They played that gap and half style where they were also an attacking upfield first-step team that had dudes that could press guys into other gaps. And it allowed them to do a lot with their linebacker position because there could be a lot of movement. Show gaps pre-snap, which would mean, hey, linebacker go step up into the B gap. You're going to attack the B gap there. And that could allow them to work off that. One linebacker could stay back. One could show into a gap. We're trying to stop the run. We want to take that gap away, right? We want to force them elsewhere. So they could show gaps. They could stack linebackers behind defensive linemen. So they could play a 2-eye and a 3. They could stack their linebackers behind. Now you don't know who's filling where. Then at the snap, they could either play that gap and a half, and linebackers can read through what gap is filled. They have a primary, secondary, or they could shift at the snap. So he's going to slant here, and now I can kick out to this gap, and that leads some openings. So they had a lot of flexibility with how they could align things too, because they were athletic on the interior, and having that athletic nose tackle build lead to some stacking disguises, as we've seen, but it also allows them to deal with a lot of different things stylistically as well. One of the advantages I think the Lions are going to have over Tampa Bay is I think their edge rusher position is going to be better against the run than what they had. They had a lot of guys that were nice players. They had a lot of nice rotational pieces. I think we have better players on the edge, clearly. We're trying to make sure we get there on the inside, and the Lions have invested in this year after year after year, but Tyleik's a huge part of that. But on the outside, I do think they are stronger, for sure. Like, I think they're better against the run. And I also think that when healthy, they're a much just better edge rushing front, right? They think they just have better piece across the board, and they've constantly invested that. Now you throw Amon into that mix, which fits like the Golston, and it fits kind of like the Nassib build of, hey, you're 6'2", 200, just under 270 pounds. You're thick in the lower body. You have some length. He fits the style, and you could see why they would have went after a guy like that, because stylistically it just makes sense. And I actually think this starts to answer kind of the question, even though this isn't the best example here, this is just an example of a play from Tampa Bay, of why the Lions maybe didn't go in a drive and say, let's just get a really good pass rusher, run defense is okay kind of deal. No, they actually still value the powerful, lengthy edge rusher that's going to set the edge against the run and win as a pocket collapser, because all of his time, Kacy Rodgers, in these, especially these 3-4 style defense, but pretty much everywhere he's been, it's been at the DN and the edge position about the depth. It's been about just having a multitude of bodies that are long, collapsing the edge, collapsing the pocket, setting the edge against the run, and that are plus pass rushers. They weren't really elite pass rushers. They didn't really have elite pass rushers at that spot, right? It was Tampa Bay was the outside linebackers, or Shaq Barrett was probably their best rusher at that time. But it's set up through the interior first and foremost, and a lot of flexibility on third down. So we'll see that here in a second. And then for Miami, it was Cameron Wake, and Cameron Wake would be our Aiden Hutchinson at this point, right? You have that one elite pass rusher, but it wasn't as much about getting the opposite guy, in my opinion. It was more about the depth and the rotation of pieces that they had that were physical, different builds that could move up and down the line of scrimmage, which I think is similar to what we have here. The overall idea, which will be demonstrated by the sacks, is get teams to third down because we will get sacks by the creativity up front and the blitzing rate. Improvement every year. 2020, again, they showed us some improvement as well. They got after the quarterback. They blitzed like crazy, and that moves you kind of that third down flexibility what they have. And on third down, what's so tough about this team, it makes them susceptible to being ran on, and you can also try to throw screens, because if you can get the ball out fast, like wide receiver screens, when they stack the line of scrimmage, this is something that they've done going back everywhere he's been. Jets, Miami, they do the same thing, where he'd stack the line of scrimmage. Maybe it's one down lineman. Maybe it's with Tampa Bay, they would get their best on the field, so it would be Vita Vea at the zero technique, and he could deal with the center, take either shade or either gap as an interior defensive lineman. That opened up a lot of flexibility up front, or they'd throw like 2, maybe 3 defensive linemen hand in the dirt, and then they just stack the line of scrimmage with every edge rusher they seemingly had. Linebackers, edge rushers, a lot of movement post-snap. Some guys in, some guys would drop, right? Guys that were flexible. So Barnes could step on the line in these spots. Lions do this with Alex and Jack Campbell. Those guys would step on the line, or Malcolm Rodriguez. And then that's when they just line those guys up. And you're probably consistent staples in that spot would be your Hutchinson with the hand in the dirt. Probably your Levi, especially early in the season. Late it'd be a Leam. Late could be a Leam, but it'd be like your Levi's and Aiden Hutchinson that put your hand in the dirt. And then you could have Davenport thrown in there as well. So you could have about 3 guys. You're like, these guys are going to rush. Maybe one of them drops, and then everybody else kind of stack up on the line. 5+ is super effective. It's really tough to deal with. Nobody wants to get in third and long against this team for that reason. And that's one thing that they do, is they have that flexibility. It's a really tough thing to deal with. The reason the value has always come back, whether that was the beginning of the Jets, whether that was Tampa Bay, clogging the middle of the paint, not allowing you to run the football, getting you into third and long, the reason that the value has always been run first, stop the run, is because of their ability to get free rushers on obvious passing downs, because there's so much creativity up front. They don't need to invest the most into hey, we got to have a number 2 pass rusher at the opposite, because if we get you in passing downs, we're going to get after you, because we're probably going to get somebody free. We're going to create confusion up front. We're going to have so many different bodies. We're going to have stunts left and right going crazy. There's going to be so much movement every time we get you in that spot. It's going to be hard to deal with. DBs are going to be blitzing. That's where we want to value. So the value instead, if we had to pick between shutting down the run on the interior and getting those pieces versus getting a number 2 edge, they would value the interior, because they say if we can get you to that down anyway, we are going to get after the quarterback in those pass down spots. That's just what they do. Even their pressure rates aren't as high, their sack numbers are typically way up there. 2020, another strong season. They blitz a ton. That's something that the Lions have done as well, so it makes a ton of sense. And again, that's the flexibility they have from the second level to be aggressive like that, because the first level is versatile enough to do it. And then in 2021, again, another strong season. Every year they got better. Second in pressure rates in 2021, hurry rates, sacks, blitzed a ton. Now, you had some drop-off, some consistency, some hit and miss there in terms of the players, but you notice everybody's pretty much the same year after year after year here for these defensive lines. Then you go into these last few seasons where he also became the run game coordinator, and you start to look at the run defensive stats and just look at the run defense that Tampa Bay has had over the last 3 years. And it's kind of crazy, because they haven't had the best fronts, but they've had a top defensive defense in the sense that they stop the run. It's the focus of their defense. They have attention to detail to, we are going to stop the run first. They will stack the box like crazy. They'll put 5 guys on the line of scrimmage. That's their goal, is they're not going to let you beat them by the run. And I love that. So the Lions need to get back to. And you can see year after year after year, they were great against the run. Pressure rates could be hit and miss a little bit. They typically got sacks, which is good. They'd finish. They get you in a tough position because you have a lot of movement in the back end. There's a lot happening up front. It's hard to block those dudes. May not rack up pressure on pressure because you don't have the dudes to do that. What they did have is they had a lot of creativity. So they got you in third down because they shut down your run. It's just tough to get the ball off on that team and find anything towards the sticks. So they were amazing against the run every single season with, again, a lot of the same players. Defensive interior was always loaded. Now they have Akeem Hicks who comes in on his last year, gives him some help. You have Sanat who comes in as well. He only played 2 years. He was in there, had an effective season for them. Still got Vita Vea, and then again the flexibility on outside. Nassib, Nelson. Now they add Logan Hall to the mix, but they're typically always built through the inside first so that they can play the run. Now, one of their issues that they had as well is their rookies didn't really hit. A lot of these draft picks they put, especially on the outside, didn't really come together, especially their high picks. Logan Hall, Joe Shoyinka, they had plenty of misses, which hurt them. I'm focusing on the defensive line here, but those things did hurt them. Kacy Rodgers, right? This was kind of Kacy Rodgers was a very different fit. I thought it was truly just going in a different direction of saying, okay, we've had the dudes that can stop the run, right? We have the flexibility to do that. We want to get some juice. We want to get after the quarterback after the past season. They add Kalijah Kancey for that. Kancey struggles against the run, kick outside of that anymore. So Kancey could play the three, and he'd play on the weak side, right? You try to hide him a little bit in that sense, and he'd play some defensive end too, because they're still playing a 3-4 defense. Sometimes they just put him at DN, aggression to do it, and still had a ton of flexibility because Kancey's freakishly agile. So they could do a lot of things laterally still up front there. But in terms of just true development overall, they didn't really get that, which I think what has hurt them is that they haven't got that. So for the Lions' sake, hopefully they're adding the right pieces better than what Tampa Bay did, because they didn't really get that jump from guys. You can see they ranked 25th in the preseason as they were leaning on their young guys, and those guys didn't come around. So again, a lot of consistency, great gain, CJ Brewer. And then we go to some of the comps here that I have. This will be different because of different front used, but the key that I would focus on here is the interior is agile, and the edge pieces are all very similar. They're big people that set the edge. They're power players. The interior is agile and versatility for the Lions specifically, with guys that can get upfield and get an edge, guys that can win. As Brad Holmes always said, back to the beginning with Levi and Aleem, can they get an edge? Can they get after as a rusher? Is there upside there? All of our interior guys have upside as a rusher, really, even including DJ Reader. We've got 4 or 5 guys that do have that when healthy between Aleem, Roy Lopez, DJ Reader, Levi Onwuzurike. And then at the same time on the edge, we're long and we're going to set the edge. We're going to play the run. That stylistically is very similar across the board here. Laterally, you can move things. You can shift fronts. You can do a lot of different games up front when you have interior guys that can move laterally like that. And so when we do the video on Ahmed and what we did on Roy Lopez and what we've done on Tyleik Williams so far, all of those pieces are agile pieces. They've all delivered really good grades for me when going through those guys as interior helpful pieces. Or in cases of Ahmed, a little bit more on the outside. Tyleik, Vita Vea. You can throw similarities there. DJ Reader, right? In terms of builds, those make sense, especially Tyleik because of his versatility. Then you would have a guy like Kancey, who you compare him to McNeil, but they're not the same size-wise. He's really closer to a guy like Mekhi Wingo because Wingo's an undersized defensive tackle who plays pretty well there. He's just undersized, that kind of plays inside, outside, kind of a tweener role, plays some D-end. Wingo's probably the most similar in terms of the snaps that they actually play. And you can see Kancey played over 200 snaps at DN. So I would actually think Wingo's the biggest comp to Kalijah Kancey from a build perspective. It's not perfect, but I think that he is. But Aleem McNeil also played over 200 snaps at defensive end. And that's because when the Lions shift their fronts, they do a lot of 4-3 Sam stuff, but sometimes they'll go into 3-4 looks. So they'll kick a guy like Aleem to defensive end. So even though he's a little bit bigger, it's kind of like what you saw in the past with a team like the Jets, right? Or with Miami, where, they would have these guys that would kick the DN that were kind of your defense tackles, but they had flexibility, especially Aleem now as he slimmed down, where you'd put these guys at defensive end. And that's something that Kancey did as well. So you could see a snap perspective similarity between Aleem and Kancey. What's the value for the Lions there is I believe they have a better run defender. Really, maybe in both, but truly in McNeil, they have a better run defender. Remember, that was a statement to Aleem. Hey, we like they're slimming down, but make sure you can still stop the run. Well, he does, and he does better than Kalijah Kancey. Maybe he doesn't. He does give you more pass rush than Kancey as of now, but, we'll see how that turns out down the road. But right now, he's better in both categories. The point is, that's probably your biggest comp. So, and we saw with the Jets personnel-wise, they made some questionable decisions. You could be looking at a guy like Mekhi Wingo that could he potentially have a similar value when he's on the field, though it would be less snaps, as a guy like Kalijah Kancey? Like if he does, the value that you would have gotten out of a piece like that with a similar type of mold, similar type of play style based on where they're going to get their snaps, you could have got that on day 3 versus them using a first-round pick. So that could just show their ability to draft. And again, personnel is not going to be in his hands. He's shown that he's gotten a lot out of guys. Most times these guys are progressing year after year just based on the highlights that I put on the screen. But then you're also looking at it from the perspective of, okay, can you actually add talent? And the Lions obviously can do that at a pretty good level. Just looking at it from that perspective, a healthy McNeil, you have the nod there over what this team did. The biggest difference is they have Vita Vea and you have DJ Reader and Tyleik Williams, right? You're trying to see, you probably won't get that guy, but how close can you get to that? And then can you have the depth? And like we said, they've always had nose tackle depth that they can rotate in with. The Lions now have really strong depth from nose tackle, at least coming into the season, especially when they'll get healthy there. Then you continue on and you have a guy like Greg Gaines and Roy Lopez. This is what I'm talking about. This is a nose tackle depth that had flexibility to play inside, outside, like he did at LA, like he did at Tampa. he basically is the exact same build as Greg Gaines, as Roy Lopez, and basically the exact same testing across the board. Almost every single stat is the same. 5'1", 640 versus a 5'19", 31-inch vert for both guys, 30 bench press rest for 36 for Roy Lopez, 901 broad jump versus an 809 broad jump. They're pretty much the same guys across the board between those two. So Lions definitely have a piece that makes a ton of sense to what Greg Gaines added for the team, which was a very valuable piece. Then on the edge, again, look at the builds. They're very similar across the board. You could probably throw Logan Hall into the Levi Onwuzurike category just from a build perspective, right? Because he was kind of an interior guy on the outside, kicked to more defensive end if you're trying to comp those two together in terms of build there. Then you have a guy like Ahmed, similar to an Anthony Nelson, a little bit shorter, but similar build, shorter within the arms a little bit as well. You have a Golston. You can compare these guys to like a Marcus Davenport. They had Nassib. You also have a Josh Paschal in the mix as well. So again, very similar across the board what the Lions have there. And then, of course, the big difference between us two in this spot is we have a Hutchinson and they don't. So they have guys, an outside linebacker that would drop into coverage, Joe Tryon. They would have Shaq Barrett, which were their best rushers, but they would drop into coverage much more. And we have an Aiden Hutchinson, which doesn't drop in coverage as much, but he's a better pass rusher than everybody that they have. So that's a big difference, too, is we just have some different styles with how you want to compare those two. And then here's one of the interesting ones as well. We both have had Pat O'Connor. Pat O'Connor was with Tampa Bay. He got things started there, and now Pat O'Connor is a Lion. So just keep an eye on that connection. Maybe it could mean something and potentially help him going forward. Overall, to me, and you see the production side of things, he's done a fantastic job everywhere he's been. He's been part of different things stylistically, typically in 3-4 defenses that have done a lot of blitzing, which will carry over. They've played much more zone, a lot of cover 3 stuff. The Lions play a lot more man. So he's not our defensive coordinator, so that really doesn't matter, I don't think, too much in this case. But he is our defensive run game coordinator, and he's had a great run defense over the past 3 seasons. Ever since he's taken on that title with Tampa Bay, they have had a fantastic run defense. With the Jets, they had a very good run defense for every year except for 2018 when it kind of took a step back. He's had really good run defense. Even with the Dolphins, you go to those last 4 seasons with Miami, he had a really strong run defense. Really, and towards the end, it kind of fell back a little bit, but he's always had a really good run defense. And that's where it starts. And for the Lions, I think they're trying to get back to that first and foremost, right? Because they were 20th in expected points added. So they were at that level that Dolphins were at their worst there when he was there as a run defense. They want to get back to being a top tier run defense. The difference is Lions play with a lead a lot. So they want to get back to that. I think he's going to help them. Schematically speaking, I think the flexibility is going to fit perfectly here. And the Lions have a ton of dudes that can play inside, outside. They're loaded with depth. And the big thing is their interior defensive line. They're trying to get back to and get to a similar spot to where Tampa Bay was, which makes the tally pick make even more sense. And then the difference is we just have a better pass rusher than all of those teams. First, from a blitzing perspective, the creative ways that he does blitz, if he can have a say in that, I'm sure that'll be something that's similar. We do some similar things, but they may even lean into that a little bit more. I think the big thing with him as a run defensive game coordinator is Barnes, Alex, Jack. These guys could become a little more aggressive in the sense that there could be a lot more shaking up on how we play the run, the aggression of playing the run, the bodies we throw towards the run, the way that we stack the line of scrimmage, the way that we overload the strength of formations. An example here would be where Tampa Bay overloads and shifts, and it puts this force of a double team on Kalijah Kancey. And as you can see, he can't hold his ground here like we would believe one of our interior guys could. So in this case, they have to keep it balanced. But if you have these guys that can do both, he can hold that double team. Now you can overload a strength, force them to work away from it, force them to work a run to a side that you want them to get to. And then all of a sudden you have that flexibility to really just diagnose and designate a lot of pieces to the run. And again, with a lot of single high safety coverage, it just gives you an extra body a lot of times. So as you can see here, one of the downfalls of a guy like Kalijah where
Kancey.
Linebackers will shift that direction, the weak side. Maybe you'll have to handle it by a nose tackle so that he can deal with the double team. That way the strong side is taken away and we can force it back to the weak side. Things like that, right? The amount of presence that he throws run game is massive. And a lot of times you get a safety down the box because they're playing cover 3, which gives them even more help against the run. But that being said, when they can't, that's where the guys that can deal with double teams helps because it frees up those backers so they don't have to have a single gap. So I think you'll see a lot of shifting front sevens post snap, an emphasis on making sure that they can stop that first and foremost. So I'm excited about this hire, Kacy Rodgers. Hopefully all that made sense. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'm out.